Um, you're in Chicago, right?
Yes.
What's the weather like up there right now?
Yeah, it's actually today was in the 50s, but we're about to
Oh,
get hit with a storm. So, Chicago winters start earlier than in other places and ends later. And really, I've been here for 2 years, and the the uh, the wind that Chicago's infamous for is no joke. It can get below 50 very quickly over here.
I've sadly I've only been there once. It was many years ago. I was there for a job interview actually at WBEZ, and just for the 2 days that I was there, I remember, yeah, I just I was, and they put me in a hotel literally because they're on the pier. They put me in a hotel right across the street, so I walked, and I just that wind was so wicked. I was
Oh,
like, ouch,
mm,
this hurts. This
it
actually
does.
hurt.
It's like needles. Somebody sticking you with thousands of needles.
Oh, so I'm good. I'm happy with what I got. So listen, I yeah, just this again is taped, so if you have to stop for anything, I'll re-ask the question. We'll just pick up where we left off.
Okay.
I gotta ask you this though. I want to start with just like a general question about you and your background. I mean, following you for many years now, you've been all over the place. You've been been doing so many things, so many creative things. But for you, how did you get into journalism? Where did this come from?
Yeah. No, that's an excellent question. Look, I am very much el hijo de Hugo y Graciela Balta, right? Like so many of us, I am my mother and father's son, and they had a great influence on me, both personally and professionally. I'm the proud son of immigrants from Peru, and like so many immigrant children, I remember going with my mother to the grocery store, to the post office, to the bank, and being her interpreter. And I don't remember what I was translating, but I do remember being a bridge between two people that were separated by language. And that was very powerful. And to be able to help my mother, an adult at an age of 9, 10 years old, that is very empowering. Secondly, my father was one of the first Peruvians to move to Paterson, New Jersey, northern New Jersey. That's where I was born and raised. And I remember going with him on the weekends to pick up total strangers, couples with their children, and he would help them find temporary housing, a temporary job. So working with the community was also very powerful for me early on. That combination of communication and certainly working with your community and lifting the community up. And then lastly, I would say both my parents gravitated to mass media as a means to learn about their adoptive country, both radio, print, and television, but also as a means to stay connected with their native country as well. And so as I was coming up and I was thinking about um, how did I get here, right? Because I certainly feel very privileged, and you look at your parents and the sacrifices that they do to not only put food on the table and a roof over your head, but allow you the means, not completely, because I certainly had student loans, but the means to get a higher education. And you look around and you look at them, and then you look at the people who help them help you. For me, it was almost a no-brainer to pick journalism as a way to not only continue some of the principles that my parents instilled on me, but also fit a need, certainly with our community, both in English and Spanish language, in a country that more often than not, regardless of the fact that Hispanic Latinos are more than 60 million strong across the country, they're often invisible in mass media and especially in mainstream English language media.
And there's a lot there I want to unwrap. My understanding, what I mean, just looking back at it, just even on your LinkedIn page, you started what at Telemundo back in the early '90s.
Yes, yeah. So again, a similar, but some also unlike. people my generation, again, children of immigrants, my parents made it a point that I be bilingual, bicultural, and there was a moment I remember, children don't want to be different. I wanted to be like everybody else. And I remember complaining to my mother about um, some bullying that was happening because of how you pronounce my name, Hugo, not Hugo, and the fact that I spoke a different language, that we ate different foods. And um, at that moment, my mother, God bless her, was very patient with me, and she said, that's not something bad. It's something good. You're special. You can speak in two languages. You can live literally in two different worlds, two different countries, and that she framed it as a superpower, and that really helped me embrace um, what I thought was a negative, being different. And because of both of them ensuring that I be proud of certainly being an American and what that represents, but also being proud of my my Peruvian roots. That helped me aggressively approach a life of being bilingual, bicultural, which then afforded me the opportunity to start my career in Spanish language media in Telemundo, New York.
Did you think early on in your career, I think those first couple of jobs, right? You were in Spanish media. Did you think that was just going to be the path, or were you thinking even back then, at some point, I want to cross over? And I don't just mean that you would go over to English speaking, media, but that somehow you'd find a way to bring the two together, which is ultimately what you're doing now. But I mean, when did that hit your mind? When did you start thinking about that?
I'm also the product of many selfless people, many mentors and sponsors. And I remember meeting my first mentor in Telemundo, and he telling me, "Hey, you're doing great work. You're doing important work." But then he started to talk to me about the need for more representation of Hispanic Latinos in English language media, where certainly in the early 90s, and even now, if you look at statistics, were absent. And he said, "You're doing great work, but you could be doing more important work in areas where there aren't people like you or me that have the ability to be able to work in both languages, and certainly in English language media. Again, there's a greater need for that. So that started my path and my 14-year career with NBC Universal. Ultimately, NBC, or then parent company General Electric, in 2002 purchased Telemundo, which then afforded me the opportunity to be a sort of bridge builder between these two countries that were separated culturally, from a business perspective, a language perspective, and so on and so forth. And that then afforded me the opportunity to work across many different markets, and not only with journalists, but also with many decision makers. So um, some of it, again, listening to people with more experience, people who care about you, mentors, sponsors. Some of it is also maturing and making sure that you're purposeful in what you're looking to achieve personally, and then drawing from the opportunities that are presented to you. I could not have foreseen that General Electric, company of, the owner of NBC, would purchase Telemundo, but I certainly seized the moment and leveraged the opportunity afforded to me to work in a capacity that seldom people get an opportunity to do so.
I wondered in all your years in this business, what have you seen when it comes to seeing more of those and hearing more of those Latin voices? I remember, yeah, coming up in the mid '90s, late '90s, there weren't a lot. I'm seeing more, but I don't know. What have you seen? It's got to have gotten better, but where are we right now?
You know, in certain aspects, we are no better now than we were when I started out 30 years ago. And in some ways, we are. And that is all driven by technology. I mean, right now, we're having a conversation, a program that you're producing because of the access to technology and how affordable technology has become, right? As someone who is a lifelong member of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and I've certainly had the opportunity to serve as its president twice, I'll tell you, part of the work of that organization and others that represent marginalized communities is to continuously advocate for a seat at the table. But because of technology, we no longer have to just continue to ask for a seat at the table. We can create our own tables. And that's exactly what you're doing. It's exactly what I do as an independent journalist. And so we're seeing more of ourselves, our community, than before because of social media, because of the digital platform. But statistically speaking, even though there are more of us in this space, we are certainly still a minority in corporate commercial media, and even in digital media. We're still, statistically speaking, when you compare the makeup of the population of those newsrooms versus the makeup of the population of whether it's local or national that they're looking to serve, we're still very much behind the eight ball.
So when you look at let's take a look at the national media. When you look at in any format, whether it's print or radio or television, whatever it is, what do they get wrong about the Latin population in this country? What do they get right?
Hmm. It's an excellent question. The first thing that they get wrong is that we're a monolithic group. You know, we are very diverse. I always tell people, you can walk from New York City to Los Angeles and come across many different people that fall under the umbrella of being Hispanic or Latino, and they're going to be all very different, right? A Hispanic Latino in New York, which is largely Caribbean, led by the Puerto Rican community, is very different than a Hispanic Latino in the West Coast, in Southern California, that is predominantly Mexican or Mexican American. And so you have more than 20 countries that have a similar language, Spanish, and so also a similar history, but there are cultural nuances between Puerto Ricans, Caribbeans versus Peruvians, Venezuelans, Argentinians, so on and so forth. Understanding those nuances, those differences, enable a storyteller, a journalist, a newsroom to be able to produce stories that are much more authentic to the communities that they serve. To try to produce a story as if it's a one size fits all and is relevant to, again, a Hispanic Latino in New York as the same as a Hispanic Latino in the state of California is arrogance and ignorance. Now, what they get right, well, I think more and more, and especially in the last 2 years under COVID and what we've seen with the exacerbation of those disparities in regards to education, housing, certainly healthcare, and then, of course, the conversations of systemic racism stemming from the killing of George Floyd, led by the Black community, but also talking about different areas in our society that suffer through the same types of discrimination. And then, of course, the divisiveness of the general election, the 2020 general election, and 4 years under Donald Trump. I think what they get better now versus then is an understanding that when they were covering the Hispanic Latino community, it was very superficial, very one-dimensional and scratching the surface. And I'll give you an example. The coverage of immigration is much more complex than people crossing the southern border, understanding the dynamics of undocumented immigrants in the United States, and that many of them actually came to the United States legally, but because of a myriad of reasons, including bureaucracy, are now undocumented is much more profound and a story that is seldom done, because what's easier, is those negative narratives of a group of people crossing the border. That's changed a bit in the last 4 years, and I in the last 5 years, and I suspect it will continue to change as the public, Hispanic, Latino, and others, demand better reporting, transparent reporting from media, regardless of the platform.
No, and I always found that was an interesting take. Whenever if I was asked at a job interview or something, it's how what is that strategy to try to reach this audience? And I thought, the first thing that always came to my mind was, well, don't just call them on certain stories. Like if it's immigration, don't say, oh, we got to find a Latino. Don't just stick them in one group like that. Like, talk to them about everything and not just one topic. I think one of the things I found, and I wondered your take on this, is the other thing too is that the Latin audience is looking for more positive stories as well. That look, I know the news a lot of times we have to report bad stuff, but we can talk about the good stuff too, and the beautiful side of humanity. But that's something they're looking for. I don't know, in your experience, and again, because you're trying to reach multiple audiences, if you have a bunch of executives sitting around you right now, and I'm sure you've had that, what do you tell them about how, what you need to be doing to, win over this audience and gain their respect? I think that's the most important, because if they respect you, they're gonna become loyal.
Yeah, I agree. The first thing I show them is the Latino News Network, which I am very grateful to have taken over in 2019. And the Latino News Network is made up of 5 independent, statewide coverage, Hispanic Latino editorial focus news and information websites, four in New England and one in the Midwest. And the foundation of the Latino News Network is based on 4 principles. It's one, to elevate the visibility and voices of the Hispanic Latino community. The second is to amplify the work of others, and certainly we have many partners in media, the work of others in this space. The third is to provide mentoring and real work experiences for young journalists. Many journalists, Latinos, journalists of color, students are not getting the mentoring and guidance that they need in order to be successful, not only in the newsroom, but in the real world. And then fourth, it's solutions journalism. It is easy to point to problems, but it's much more difficult, and studies have found much more profound and interesting to all audiences when you start to lend your platform to discuss the solutions to the ills that we have in our society. Now, that's the long game. What we have in mass media, certainly in legacy media, is the short game. They're looking, to hit a home run every time they go at bat. But that is a short-sighted approach to success. When you think about the long game, and to use a baseball analogy, and you're looking to get to base, you're looking to, get a couple of singles and doubles. Over the long haul, you're going to be successful. This isn't an industry where someone should look to get on the fast track to success. This is one that you need to build trust with the community, and in building trust with them, it's about being transparent and how you story tell from concept to execution. But it's also one that celebrates the wins as much as they point to the challenges. And if you're pointing to the challenges, you must integrate into that narrative what are the solutions, which is a conversation that then integrates and is inclusive of a larger group, and not just the ones that you're talking about. So if you're going to talk about gun violence here in Chicago and point to, say, a shooting on the south side of Chicago where it's predominantly Black and brown communities, and you're not talking about what the solutions are, then you're creating a narrative that all of the crime in Chicago is happening in one area, and the problems can be attributed to the people who live there. When, if you take the time to really unpack those issues, you realize that what those communities are living through is part of systemic racism that over decades and decades have put them in a situation where they're desperate and in crisis, and the solutions to those problems are going to take, if not as much as it took to create them, even more so.
First of all, I appreciate you getting the sports metaphor in there. That's always a good thing. I love that. With the baseball, especially baseball. I think back to something you said at the beginning, and I think about how I grew up as well. And so, coming to this country when I was very young, I remember, my father would, come home from work, we'd have dinner, and then he'd sit down, watch the news. He watched Spanish news first. It was the most important thing because he wanted to see he's Colombian, so he wanted to see what's going back in South America, what's happening at home. And then he would watch the American news, the English speaking news. And throughout his life, he's been that. I mean, he's been doing both. I wondered, from what you've seen, your experience, and the data you've collected over the years, is when you're talking about this audience, and especially if they're new to the country, and Spanish may still be their predominant language, are they just looking for the Spanish news, as you said, also to stay connected to home? Or are they trying to move over to English news, English speaking news, even though it's not going to give them always that connection back to home? We don't do enough stories about what's going on in their home country. What have you seen in these audiences? What are they looking for exactly?
You know, it's very subjective, and I'll use my parents as an example. Both my parents have been in this country, obviously longer than I have been in this planet, right? More than 50 years. And when you look at my father, he's fully bilingual. He's someone that gravitates to media both in English and Spanish, and he's going to English media for certain types of news, whether primarily local news, what's happening in our neighborhoods and in the state that he lives in, etc. And then he's gravitating to Spanish language media for a different take, right, from the perspective of a Hispanic Latino that is foreign born, which is a lot of the focus that Spanish language media, regardless of the platform, focuses on. And that's very important. And then, of course, there's the connection to back home. Not that all the time there's news from Peru, and usually when it does penetrate, it's either politics or perhaps a natural disaster or a sporting event. But then you have my mother, who's still predominantly Spanish dominant, and rarely consumes any media in English. And that's more about her comfort zone and what she's looking for and what her needs are as a Spanish dominant speaking naturalized citizen. Now, some of it is also based on, I don't see myself, right? Does my father consume more English language news than Spanish language? No. I think part of that has to do with the fact that when he does see himself, it's always in a negative light. It's never about his experience. A hardworking immigrant-born Hispanic Latino, another naturalized citizen, who's a small business owner. He didn't start that way, but that's how he retired. That's not what you usually see in English language media. Often it's a negative narrative, and it's often a caricature of who they are. So one, it's really about their preference. And secondly, it's a lack of reflection and inclusion in English language media.
No, that's it. No, that's a really interesting point. How about also when it comes to the faces and the voices that they see and hear? Is it important for them to see, someone like them? Is it important to see a Latino doing the news or in English, or is that not important?
I think it's important. Look, I think studies have shown that you want to see yourself in the media that you consume, whether it's news, whether it's uh, television, movies, what have you, right? You want to see yourself, and so that's very important. But it's not necessarily having a starring role. We are a community like so many other immigrant communities that are not necessarily looking for the spotlight, but we want to be included in the conversation. How often, and I'm sure you've had a similar experience, how often do Hispanic Latinos, regardless of their proficiency in Spanish, whether you can speak it fluently or you know a couple of words, when you enter a room and you see people clustered in four corners and you go to one group, if they're speaking in Spanish, if you can speak in Spanish, you don't want to be disruptive. You're going to Spanish language and be part of that conversation. If you walk to another corner and they're speaking English, you're going to be speaking in English. Again, it's about wanting to be part of the conversation, not having the spotlight or being disruptive. So, yes, it's very important to see yourself presenting the news, reporting the news, because it's a reflection of the people that you know. But more importantly, it's having the Hispanic Latinos behind the scenes, the producers, the executive producers, the news directors, people that have larger influence and what stories are selected, the focus of those stories, and which are the voices that are used to tell those stories. Those are the positions where we're certainly lacking representation as well, but have the resources and influence to provide stories that are much more authentic and reflective and inclusive of our communities and other marginalized communities.
I wanted to get your sense on this. This is an interesting story that we've seen unfold here in Miami. Is you have a very large Latin media, group, actually numerous groups, and so there's radio and television, so much available. And I wondered, is there a difference between how they typically do the news in Spanish speaking countries compared to the US, predominantly English speaking programs? Is there a difference in style? Is there a difference in tone, whatever? Because I wonder, somebody said this to me, and I don't watch enough to be able to say that, but they said, it seems like his Spanish programming, it's so sensationalized. American TV could also be sensationalized too. So, but I don't. Is there a difference in tone and style, the way they present the news in the two languages?
I think the quick answer is yes, right? So I think there's certainly a difference in general between some of the storytelling in local news versus national news, both in English and Spanish. But to differentiate Spanish language and English language as an example, and there are many different examples. I would say, and it's changing slowly, but one of the biggest faults that I give Spanish language local news is the exploitation of women in news. And so often, again, it's changing. But I remember coming up, if you were a woman and you wanted to break into the business, broadcast news locally, they would look for you to start in weather and they would sex it up, from the way they use their hair to the clothing that they wore, really putting women in positions that were very uncomfortable and certainly exploited them. Now, another difference is that often comes up is advocacy journalism. Oh, Spanish language news is advocating for they're pro-immigration, they're pro-immigrant, etc. And Jorge Ramos from Univision is often criticized by English language media and people who follow media for doing that. The same happened in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, where African American journalists were criticized for not being objective in their coverage of the protests and some of the civic unrest that happened afterwards. That is a point of view based on privilege and from someone that doesn't understand the Black experience in the United States. What those journalists were doing, and what Jorge Ramos and other Hispanic Latinos are doing, is they're being very transparent about their experience in wearing those shoes, and they're providing audiences a reporting that is seldom seen, that is transparent and authentic and based on their courage of really sharing that aspect of their lives. We need to see more of that in journalism, and especially in English language, that often hides behind objectivity, which objectivity, of course, I don't subscribe to, is created on the false pretense that there's only two sides to a story and there's a balance between reporting. When objectivity is written by news managers that are overwhelmingly not reflective and inclusive of the communities that they serve. What I'm trying to say is, I'm not going to subscribe to a news manager's objectivity when that wasn't written with me in mind, meaning a Hispanic Latino, a marginalized member of the community. I subscribe to transparency, which allows me to tell the audience every step of the way the news gathering process, and they could be critical about that process, but they will appreciate, and more often than not, studies show, trust that type of reporting. And that's what we see in Spanish language media, and that's what we see with the African American community in their coverage of the aftermath of George Floyd.
I agree with you completely. I know. I mean, just from a lot and black reporters that I've known, over these last 4 years, and seeing how they have done their job, and they've explained to me so much of what you're saying, which is, how can you not? One of the things that I would remind, our white counterparts to understand, like, we all do it. We're human beings. Remember 9/11. Tell me how many, I mean, the real anchors, reporters, you tell me you weren't emotional when you saw that. You tell me you were objective. We all were affected, but you were affected. We saw it on TV. Go back, I would say even further. Edward R. Murrow, the man that we all look to as a hero in this business, stood up to bullies in Congress. And, there was no objectivity. It's like, we got to defend what America stands for, and we can't allow this to happen. Let me finish with this, and I appreciate you bringing up objectivity and giving us your ideas of it. What is it that we need to be doing as journalists? English or Spanish, doesn't matter. What do we need to do as journalists? Because we've been attacked a lot lately. That's not new. I just think it's gotten worse, but it's not new. But what are we doing that we're not getting the message across to people about who we are and what we're really here to do? What's, because it seems like the message is being controlled by somebody else.
Yeah. Look, I think some of that I've mentioned in describing transparency and the importance of building trust with the audiences that you serve by being transparent about the whole process. There's two thoughts on that. The first, to add to transparency, the first is, as a philosophy, journalism, newsrooms, regardless of language, operate from a top-down approach. We're the journalists, we're more educated than you, we will tell you what you need to know. Top down. We have to flip that. We have to have a bottom-up approach. We need to spend time listening to the communities that we serve, going to where they live, and being inclusive of them in the news gathering process. They need to be a part of how we shape the process, from conceptualizing ideas to the focus, to approving those ideas, to the focus of the stories, to who gets to tell those stories. In doing so and being transparent in that process, that builds trust and that chips away at this notion that we've created, and that legacy media has created, of the elitist um, journalists. And then the last thing is we have to be unapologetic of our constitutional responsibility. Journalism is the only industry that is protected by the Constitution. It is our responsibility to hold the powerful accountable, to give voice to the voiceless, and to empower the public to act, to make better decisions. I have no apologies in my pursuit of the truth. I don't care where the truth ends, whether it's positive or negative to a person or an organization. It is my job to speak truth to power. And if that makes people uncomfortable, especially the C-suite that is overwhelmingly white male, then so be it. I didn't become a journalist to make friends or to become popular. I became a journalist to uphold um, our constitutional duty of those three principles.
And I will remind people this is a lonely job sometimes because we're not popular.
Yeah.
That goes with the game. Hugo, I appreciate everything as always, man. I really do, and continued everything that you're doing, man. Continued success. I got to have you back. There's so much to talk about. I really do appreciate it, though.
Thank you, Luis. I really enjoyed talking to you, and thank you for the invitation.
All right, let me stop the broadcast.